My guest today is Scott Holland. I first got to know Scott when I was a graduate student in 1987 at the University of Pittsburgh, and stumbled into Pittsburgh Mennonite Church, where Scott was the pastor. Unfortunately, I was running away from being Mennonite, and so I didn't show up very often. But it's great to reconnect with you, Scott, and to have you here on this conversation that we'll have. And would you just say a bit about what you've been up to since the last time I would have seen you, which was 30 or 35 years ago, and what you're doing now?
Yeah, thanks, Conrad. It's great to see you again after all these years. I've done many things since we last saw one another. I've pastored congregations, Mennonite as well as Church of the Brethren congregations in Pennsylvania, as well as Ohio. And I have just completed over 2 decades of teaching at Bethany Theological Seminary and the Earlham School of Religion in partnership as a tenured professor in theology and culture and director of peace studies. But I've stayed on this year as Emeritus professor in Theopoetics and writing. This is a new program that I helped develop, a rapidly expanding program at both Bethany and Earlham. And so I still teach the core courses in Theopoetics there. I divide my time, therefore, between Richmond, Indiana, which is where Bethany and Earlham are located. I'm coming to you today from Yellow Springs, Ohio. This is my writing studio, not far from the Ohio-Indiana border. And then our family home is in Pittsburgh. And so I'm most often in Pittsburgh these days.
So what is Theopoetics, Scott?
Theopoetics is, you'll find surprisingly, not distant from some of the dispositions that we might be identifying in Pietism. And I'll say a bit more about that as our conversation around Pietism develops. But it's the idea that when we look at faith as it comes to us in scriptures, in the stories of tradition, in the experiences of people, it often comes not as flat propositions, but in metaphor, in poetic expressions, in stories, in songs, and in really more artful confessions of how we have arrived at meaning as we try to name God, ourselves, and the world around us. So it really is an approach to thinking about God, world, self, and others much more in deeply spiritually poetic terms rather than in flatly logical doctrinal terms. And we have a program now that is attracting a wide variety of students from many denominational backgrounds who've become weary of the kind of theological disputes and divisions that plague modern Christendom. And they're finding that Theopoetics is a place where they're finding common ground to listen and learn from one another.
So, Scott, this is really off the topic, except maybe not so, but as I've come to know Walter Brueggemann in writing his theological biography, coming to understand the impact he had on the field in moving away from form criticism and the historical ways of looking at the Old Testament, in particular his influence related to this move that Brueggemann and Gottwald and Phyllis Tribble and Meilenberg, others made from this form critical approach to a more interpretive social science approach that Brueggemann calls post-critical.
Yeah, it relates very well because the post-critical approach in biblical scholarship, and I could also say in literary criticism, which is an analogous field, invites us to listen to the story itself and invites us also to some what we might call reader response to the text, and reader response that isn't simply solitary reader response, but what sometimes we call the hermeneutics of peoplehood, reading the text in a communal conversation and trying to determine how the text comes alive. And it doesn't exile the idea that we try to get into the world of the text, the world behind the text, and the world in front of the text. But some forms of criticism, whether literary criticism or biblical criticism, actually don't make the creative move from the world behind the text and the world of the text that we're doing analysis of to the world in front of the text. How does the text speak to us in our living world today? And how do we make meaning of that text? Via reader response, via the hermeneutics or interpretation of peoplehood, and varieties of approaches that draw on story and metaphor and human experience, in addition to what we find within the world of the text itself.
So when I talked to Walter, he would say that his approach is he makes the historical connections in the text. Then he would say, I layer on sociology, looking at what God is up to in the world today. And then I throw on top of that theology, how God made this connection between theology, sociology, and history. How is what you're doing, and does it take it beyond that, or is it within that kind of framework?
Well, I think it's within that framework, within Pietism, since we're talking about Pietism. There was the Pietist quadrilateral that Wesley made famous, but it's present in Zinzendorf and others, and that is that when we try to name divinity as well as humanity, we look at texts, the texts of Scripture, tradition, the rich stories of faith that are in front of the text. We look at human experience, our deeply intuitive, imaginative, inspired experiences in life. And then we also look at reason. And all of those dynamics, I think, come together as we're seeking understanding. So what I think we're doing in Theopoetics would chime very nicely with Brueggemann's style of biblical hermeneutics and scholarship. And in fact, in our program, we have used his book, Finally Comes the Poet, which is a really nice view of how he understands the prophets not simply as flatly prophetic, but as poet prophets. So he will identify Isaiah, for example, as the poet prophet Isaiah, which is great. It adds a kind of broader dimension to the communication, I think.
Scott, can you talk to us about Pietism? So my journey through to this has been with Walter in the synod from the West that he grew up in, the Evangelical Synod. But can you talk to us broadly about Pietism, the various streams of it, and why it has difficulty finding residence in North America or in modernity?
Yeah, let me first recommend what I find to be the best book as an introduction to German Pietism in particular, and Pietism more broadly. And that is by Douglas Schantz, and it's entitled An Introduction to German Pietism, and it's published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Anyone interested in a deep dive into Pietism, you see it's a rather thick book, you'll find a really scholarly treatment, as well as a kind of useful definition of the various streams of Pietism. And Pietism was in many ways reacting against, as you've already talked about in the podcast, some of the scholasticism that was part of the emerging movement of the Enlightenment, with such an intense focus on reason and rationality. And that if in some way we could name the faith systematically and doctrinally and rationally, that we would capture the faith. And it's important to say that in Pietism, there is not an exiling of reason, but there is rather a search for a broader understanding of reason. And we like to say, as we're trying to unpack the meaning of Pietism, Pietism was interested in a more holistic epistemology. At the great Pietist University at Holland, there was the sense that reason is not simply about flat logics, but it also includes the sensuous perception of reality. And by sensuous perception of reality, this was including imagination and intuition and inspiration and feeling, Gefühl, deep feelings. And so what we like to say is that Pietism at its best attempted to unite head and heart and hand, a more holistic understanding of the human person and a broader conception of consciousness and how consciousness works. Pietism also influenced German Romanticism, especially the early German Romantics, and they were also pushing back against the flat reason of the Enlightenment and what some of the early German Romantics, influenced by the early Pietists, because many of them were formed in Pietist homes and communities, they would say that reason can only follow the paths that are first broken open by imagination, inspiration, intuition, because reason itself is not an essence, it is actually a practice that involves a more holistic understanding. So if there's no new inspiration, if there's no new moment of spiritual intuition, there can be no new ways of reasoning. And so in Pietism, as well as in early German Romanticism, there was this expanded understanding of how we know what we know in that old field called epistemology. And so, as you've already talked about in the podcast, there was this emphasis on a heart knowledge as well as a head knowledge, a heart strangely warm, to use Wesley's direct quotation. But whether English pietists or German pietists, that notion was present, the heart strangely warmed.
Talk to us about where Anabaptism lies within this and the streams of Anabaptism. And so, as I've said to you, I've gotten pushback when I suggested that in my small sliver of Mennonite experience and history, I haven't experienced, it was news to me that there was Pietism in our background. And part of that is partly the fact that I'm not a historian or a theologian. And so I come to this in my own kind of work. But can you talk to us about the Church of the Brethren and Brethren in Christ, the Mennonites, where these streams have taken hold, where they haven't, the history of them, and so on?
Yeah, so what we're working with today as historians and theologians, when we look back at the Anabaptist movement and the early Pietist movement and movements of radical Pietism, is something called polygenesis and polyphony. Let me define that quickly. We now realize that there were multiple origins of Anabaptism coming out of diverse spiritual movements on the continent. And there were likewise multiple origins of Pietism. And so sometimes we've simplified things too much, saying the Anabaptists are this and the Pietists are that, when actually there were many movements, polygenesis, many movements with many voices that sometimes complemented one another, sometimes conflicted with one another, polyphony, many voices. So scholarship now is looking at the many movements that gave rise to Anabaptism and Pietism, and they were actually spiritual renewal movements. Persons who had become disillusioned with the established churches and saw a dismantling that was already occurring. And rather than simply step away from spirituality, they were searching for new expressions of the faith. And so, just as a quick footnote, we often think of Anabaptism today as being defined most clearly by H.S. Bender's 1943 address, The Anabaptist Vision, which was his address to the Society of Church Historians. And that's a fine address, but some of us who have been a bit more critical of Bender, as well as affirming, have said, yeah, he kind of focused on a stream of Anabaptism, Mennonitism, to the exclusion of some other streams. And his good friend, Professor Friedman, was very critical of Pietism, and he felt that Pietism, this would be Robert Friedman, who was at Western Michigan University, he felt Pietism really didn't lead to productive ways of being in the world, a positive social ethics, because it was so inward. I think that's an incorrect reading of Pietism, but that was his reading. And so there wasn't a great deal of interest or emphasis in Bender's view of the Anabaptist vision in Pietism proper. But in the early Anabaptist movement, there were figures who practiced a kind of Anabaptist mysticism. And one figure in particular that I like very much was Hans Denk, who is known for South German Anabaptist mysticism. And what I sometimes tell my students who are grappling with the definition of Pietism, I say, and this is somewhat of a simplification, but it works. When you think of Pietism, think of a Protestant form of mysticism. Because a lot of the impulse that came out of medieval Catholic mysticism found its way into Pietism. Some of the writers, the mystical writers like Meister Eckhart, were read by the early German Protestant Pietists. And so there are many movements. Anyone who's really interested in how these movements overlap and come together, I have a couple of pieces that I think those who are interested in both Anabaptism and Pietism might find interesting. One piece I call The Pietist as Strong Poet, a Brethren Corrective to the Anabaptist Communal Soul. And it's in a book entitled New Perspectives in Believers' Church Ecclesiology. And I try to show how these streams can come together and can complement one another. And the other piece that explicitly addresses this is entitled, Have the Brethren Traded Love Pietism for Anabaptist Discipline? And that's in the collection Brethren, Intersections, History, Identity, and Cross-Currents. And these writings come out of the most recent Brethren World Conference, which called many Brethren groups together. Just quickly, I'll say that there is a figure that I've been working with, and I could talk about him at length, and he shows up in my piece in this book. His name is Ernst Christoph Hockmann von Hockenau, quite a name. He was an early German pietist who preached in both Mennonite gatherings and in these emerging gatherings that were known as pietist gatherings that were distinct from Mennonite churches or gatherings. And he was heard and warmly received in in both groups. Some of us argue that he's really the true founder of the Schwarzenau Brethren, not Alexander Mack. He was Alexander Mack's mentor, and he resisted allowing the movement that he found himself part of, which connected with Mennonites as well as these emerging pietists. He resisted allowing that to simply become one more denomination. That, he said, was not his goal. This was a kind of renewal movement. And because of that, he and Alexander Mack broke company, and Alexander Mack, of course, began yet another group of German Baptist Brethren, today known as the Church of the Brethren, and related groups. But I like him very much, and his emphasis on many of the themes that were central to Pietism, but themes that the Mennonites of his day actually heard and warmly received as well.
So Scott, when you said that the Brethren had exchanged, and I forget what the word was, but for Anabaptist discipline, that's where I would have come from.
Yeah.
Roots are all old Order Amish. The culture I grew up in was Amish, conservative Mennonite. And so that's how I would frame the life I knew, was discipline with very little of the warmth that you describe. And so what happens to pietism when, Camphausen says that it's hard for pietism to find a home. So if it's a movement, is it a sustainable movement, or do these movements come and go? And can they not be contained? Can they not be captured? Can they not be held in something?
Yeah, it seems to me that any new charismatic religious renewal movement, and I'm using the word charismatic here in the Max Weber sociological sense, not in the contemporary Pentecostal sense, can quickly become institutionalized in the second or third generation, right? And so that initial impulse is often lost in the process of institution building and identity formation and perpetuation. And it seems to me that these movements often come in waves. I think in the Church of the Brethren, in all of the interesting and sometimes important institution building that went on, the denomination became close to a mainline denomination with all the markings of that. And I think these impulses of renewal, which so often are connected with a kind of dismantling of a status quo, are not always welcome, because they can be seen as disruptive of institutional life and work. We're seeing today a great deal of interest in a number of our students, some in the Theopoetics program, some in many other seminary programs, who are interested in rediscovering Pietism as a movement. Many are also interested in rediscovering Anabaptism, which can also become reified and institutionalized. So I think this is a good time, because I think we are seeing a time in the church today that seems to be not only post-ecclesial, look what's happening to our churches from sea to shining sea, but also post-secular. You know, back in the 60s, a number of theological thinkers like Harvey Cox, when he wrote The Secular City, was thinking we would all be celebrating secularity, and that the manifestation of spirituality would be embodied more in secular forms of life. He later recanted that observation and said, no, that really isn't right. I think what we're seeing today is a movement that is post-ecclesial, but happily for those of us who care about spirituality, it's also post-secular. Many are not searching for meaning in a flatly secular worldview, but there's this sense that there's something more, and there's this reach for something more. And I think Pietism can be one possibility for finding that something more. That is the renewal of Pietism. If this is a renewal movement and was a renewal movement, it has to be constantly renewing itself. We can't go back and look at ancient documents that were written at Holland or another university and say, this is it. It has to be living today.
So, Scott, one denomination that I'm very familiar with has said that that within it, they will recapture the movement. Can movements be developed out of these staid 300-year-old structures that we have? I mean, I'm skeptical, but your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm skeptical too, unless there's a kind of freedom in these denominations to grant a lot of imaginative, innovative space for local congregations to see where the Spirit might be leading them. I think in the structures themselves, it's really hard to see these renewal movements. But I would say that now in what we're seeing relative to a kind of dismantling of various forms of denominational Christendom, we are seeing in some denominational churches some new life and some new movement. I'm thinking of a particular conference within the Mennonite Church. I'll name it because it's one I care about. The Allegheny Conference of the Mennonite Church in Western Pennsylvania. There has been a great exodus of some congregations from that conference to more conservative, traditional conferences. But the churches that remain and still identify with the Mennonite Church USA, there seems to be new life there. And persons from traditions outside of Anabaptism and Pietism are finding their way to those congregations and finding some life. So I wouldn't want to say, no, with thunder, it can never happen within denominational churches, but I do think it's a challenge. And I think there must be some reimagination of the kind of space that's given to local congregations to listen and learn from one another and to listen and learn to where the Spirit might be leading.
I was intrigued by your language of freedom, that these structures or systems must have enough freedom to allow self-criticism or self-critique or new expressions. And I think that's part of the challenge. For me, it has been part of the challenge in the last 3 years as I have challenged denominations or congregations or the church to reconsider its structures. It's things like credentialing, how credentialing gets in the way of, for years in our tradition, it got in the way of women being credentialed.
Yeah.
So just challenging some of those structures and offering what I thought was simply a photograph of what I saw to be real from my perspective. But that was a hard go, which is why I turned to Walter eventually, because it's a tough road to speak these things that one sees. But I think for me, it wasn't until I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease that I stepped out of it forced me to, it brought a new perspective, Scott. And so it was transformative for me, both in my experience of the presence of God, the love of God, and the way I saw the church in the world, the way I saw my students. Suddenly I saw my students differently, more as human beings who in search of hope, in search of life, and stepping now out of the church as a leader has just given me more of that perspective. But when you're in the middle of that, it's so hard to allow yourself the freedom or to allow anybody else the freedom. I shut down that kind of freedom within myself and others, and that's tough.
Yeah, I think that's so right. I think for many of us, who want to be team players or good community members of a denomination, it's easy to kind of comply with the established system as it is. And often it takes something to decenter that compliance. It could be a personal crisis, a personal illness. I think for many of us, it was actually the huge controversy around LGBTQ plus persons in the church. And when we saw members of our congregations, members of our families, beloved neighbors who were being condemned by the denomination or excluded by the denomination, and when we found that we stood with them and for them and by them, that the denominations then turned on us, strangely, it gave us freedom to rethink our positions within those denominations and to be less compliant around other things, including towing the institutional lines.
I'm intrigued too by the notion of freedom that you note, because as I look at the body of Walter Brueggemann's work over 6 decades, that emphasis on emancipation has just grown in the body of his work. And he's just finished up a series of essays, and that idea of emancipation, the emancipation of God from the social structures we've created in categories, the emancipation of the church, the emancipation of the neighborhood, those three run right together. In fact, I'm editing a volume for him at Fortress Press's request, and those are the three categories: the emancipation of God, the emancipation of the neighborhood, the emancipation of the church. And I think without that, we can't reimagine what God's up to, what God has for us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that that stream of prophetic, and I would also say poetic thought, has been present in Brueggemann's work consistently through his many books. He has lectured on our seminary campus at Bethany Theological Seminary, Earlham School of Religion. And what I was struck by in his lectures was not only how prophetic he was, but how poetic he was in his prayers, in his reflections. And that to many of us revealed that there was a real attention to the depths of human consciousness, that also we would say would be the depths of spirituality, broadly understood. And I think those themes have been very consistent in Brueggemann's work, which is why many of us have read him consistently over the years and have benefited greatly by his writing as well as from his voice.
Thank you, Scott. Is there anything else you'd like to say about Pietism that is important for us? I think one question I have is, what is the language that you find yourself using? You talked about Protestant mysticism, but when I use the word Pietism or pietistic or whatever it is, I just get this pushback continually.
Yeah. And
what do you do about that?
Well, I try to re-educate because I think it's a rich movement, right?
Yes.
It's a rich movement from its origins, and it can remain a rich movement today. I should mention that we had a global conference on Pietism, an ecumenical global conference on Pietism at United Theological Seminary of Dayton, Ohio, this past summer. And United Seminary is part of what is now the United Methodist Church, but it was originally a United Brethren in Christ church, not Brethren in Christ, but United Brethren church, which came out of a pietist movement that actually emerged in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, when a Mennonite preacher and a German Reformed preacher each had an awakening and came together. And it was then a movement for many, many years before they formed a denomination. So at our conference in the summer, there were persons from all around the world, including some of the Scandinavian countries. They zoomed in. And they're using the word pietism, trying to recover the word pietism. I think it's important in the USA to clarify that pietism is not Puritanism. And I think there is this false identification in the USA that when we say pietism, we mean a kind of self-righteousness, we mean a kind of piety as holier than thou, a kind of goody two-shoes self-righteousness. Pietism is not Puritanism. It's something that we might say today, using vocabularies of today, that sought to be very integrative in its spirituality, very holistic in its spirituality, pulling together the life of the mind, the passions of the heart, and all the loves and longings and losses of the body, something very intersectional, integrated, holistic. So I like to educate our students and anyone else who might ask around the richness of the term pietism in its continental origins. It can be a rich term, but yeah, it's certainly understandable that when you use it today, many are thinking that you're talking about some kind of goody two-shoes self-righteousness. And it's not that at all, because the pietist heart was the heart strangely warmed. It was a hospitable heart, open to all. And this pietist that I mentioned earlier, Hochmann, believed it was a heart of universal love and restoration. It was not a heart that sought to condemn others, but to extend grace, universal grace to others, and what he called no force in religion.
Mm-hmm. I think as I listened to you say those things, I thought of Weber again, saying, that the only way to break out of this cage rationality is to recover a charisma and what he called ancient ideals. And so what you're referring to are these ancient ideals that can't be quantified, categorized, but there's, as you were speaking, this intersectionality, and I could feel it from you. I wanted to capture that for a moment there, Scott, the radiance that was coming from you, because it's to me, that's what that heart strangely warm exudes for us.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's theology that isn't simply about composing yet one more doctrine or one more theology book. It's about composing a life. Yeah. How do we compose a life that matters? Yeah.
Scott, this has been delightful, and I hope we can do this again, because I've got more and more questions for you.
Oh yeah, we can do it. I'm kind of semi-retired. Being Emeritus, okay. I still teach, but I have no faculty meetings, no institutional service, so I can hang out with you. I can attend your Brueggemann sessions. It's great. So I'd be open to it. Sure.
I'm sure that folks, after they listen to this, see this, will have questions for you. So we'll get you back live sometime.
Yeah, I'll come back. And thanks for doing this on Brueggemann. Yeah. This is a real gift. Not only, the podcast, but the book that you've written. And it's great. It's so good. So thanks. And it's, delight to see you again after all these years.
Yeah, it's delightful to see you and to exchange with you. And thank you again, Scott. Blessings to you, and we'll be in touch.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.